Welcome to a micro lesson on the Distinctively Visual, a module of the high school certificate, and in this module we're using and looking at Henry Lawson. This is the shortest of the 4 stories set for this module. Lawson wrote this from personal experience. He was sent from Sydney to Bourke by train. The story begins in Bathurst and goes from Bathurst along the Western Line all the way out to Bourke. It's a travel log, it's a personal journey told by the persona in the first person. Lawson's story was published in the Bulletin magazine, and one of Lawson's aims was to provide people with an insight into the lives and into the climate and into the lifestyle of those people who lived in the outback. And here's a map of New South Wales showing you the train line. This trip by train and subsequently his travels outside of Bourke away from the railway line really influenced what Lawson wanted to make clear and to visually depict or render for his readership. This is a paddock in Bathurst. Verdant green, beautiful blue sky and nice big fat lambs. This story that we're about to look at is not set in such a bountiful climate. In this particular story, Lawson actually sketches what's not actually in the landscape. So you won't see any big mobs, or he won't describe any big mobs, and you won't see any men at work. Lawson wants to sketch for the responder, both then, early 1900s, and now, for contemporary readers, the effects of the drought on the landscape and on the people who made their lives in that district. So the land isn't bountiful. This is again Bathurst. And this is again Bathurst, but in a drier season. So you get to see that there is quite a significant change. So now we figuratively get on board and we go with Henry Lawson on his trip from Bathurst to Bourke. He makes us participants by the style of writing that he employs, and he enables us to see not only the landscape, not only what happens inside the train between the characters, but also what goes on outside the train. In a Dry Season by Henry Lawson. The sketch begins with the instructional verb draw, and Lawson invites the responder to actually construct the bush all along the New South Wales Western Railway line from Bathurst on. Lawson creates an isolated landscape, bereft of people, and he also emphasises this by using adjectives like scattered to describe the sheep as they run away from the railway line. He establishes the uniformity and the monotony of the landscape using qualifiers like all, so it implies everywhere, and prepositions like along to have us, the responder, create this uniform sheep country in our mind's eye. Lawson extends the monotony and the uniformity to also include the settlements that he sees and describes outside of the train. He creates these generalisations using a, so a pub, a school, and a general store. Notice his use of positional language, so that you have the house is in the distance, the schoolhouse is in the distance, the general store is on piles. This actually demands of the responder the placement of the setting in a particular fashion, thus rendering an image. He then goes on to describe the first group of men that we come upon in his sketch. And here we're introduced to their horses, the ungroomed hacks. And it's revealed to us that the men are in the pub having a drink. This is a strong sense of mateship and a strong image of mateship. He then creates an image of a stock character, the sundowner, and he has him sitting reading the bulletin on the veranda, thus actually creating unity between all of the readership, because the sundowner was, sort of a lowly member of the Australian society of the time. And in unifying the responder to the sundowner, Lawson actually has brought the responder into relationship, and therefore the notion of sort of an egalitarian society, which is a very important image in Lawson's work. Of course, there are other towns along the line, but they are much poorer and more vulnerable, as are the inhabitants. So economically portrayed in the 3 lines that describe a woman outside of her home looking up at the train line and throwing out the washing water. Lawson actually transports the reader here to the box bark humpy with a clay chimney. This descriptive detail gives a clear picture of the poverty. The lone figure of the woman depicts the isolation of the bush, especially for women. Having talked so generally about uniformity and having portrayed the uniformity for us in his images, he repeats the instruction to the responder to visualise the world that he is going to introduce us to by using the artist's motif. Note here that it's a watercolour sketch, which is quite a romantic notion. So we paint in our minds the fettler's tent, and then the fettlers standing round. Again, men not working. These men that are standing round have a billy hanging over a fire, and the fettlers all stand around, filling their pipes. In the brevity of 3 lines, using an economic style, Lawson draws us into his view and admiration for the working man. Ironically, he's not at work. He's at rest. He's taking a tea break, a smoko, and it's significant because the fettlers were union men, and Lawson was a union man. He very much was a champion of workers' rights, and his readers at the time would have known and understood that fettlers weren't supposed to actually stand around and have cups of tea. They were actually quite governed as to what time they could and could not work. Of course, at the time and on the side of the railway line, it would be very hard to administer. And so these men are shown as slightly defiant and participating in the art of mateship, which is an important image for Lawson, for he sees it as part of a sort of national way of being, or a national identity. The reader's attention is now drawn back inside the carriage, and there are a series of descriptions of the men that begin to drop in on the train once they passed Bathurst. This implies that they're different. So he uses a lot of visual detail about clothing. Apparel is actually a motif that runs through the text and gives us insight into their social background, their actual job or occupation, their wealth or the lack of it, and even their emotional state. He notes that on a number of hats, crape is worn. Physical detail is given, 3 inches of crape and where it's placed, again, round the crown. The hats are old-fashioned, implying long use and giving the responder a very clear indication of how to imagine the men who wear them. These are not wealthy men, they're working men. But again, Lawson has them stationary and travelling. Lawson uses the motif of death across all 4 of the stories, and certainly in this story it reoccurs on a number of levels. So you've got the imagery and symbolism of the crepe. You've got the comments that it's a death in the family and that some passage of time may have passed. And then you have this ironic statement where he says, bereavement usually has a jolly red face beneath the hat, for death is the only cheerful thing in the bush. The idea of linking cheer and death creates tension. The responder can imagine the men and indeed their loss. So Lawson has managed to have the responder not only picture the people, but to become involved and feel great sorrow for their circumstance. The laconic humour makes evident that death is a constant for those who live in the bush. Having mentioned Bathurst, the railway towns, the small communities, and then having looked in on the men that are on the train, he now looks out again, outside of the train, with that unity of all the men that are in the carriage. We crossed the Macquarie River, the narrow, muddy gutter. So the responder is actually actively involved in it with the verb crossed, and can easily see that the river is depleted and in drought because of the sense of something being narrow, and also the idea of the water being muddy. Lawson often adds local detail that's quite domestic so that we can imagine it. So in the Macquarie we have the dog swimming, while we have the wilder image of the goat chasing the dog. The names of the places, the names of the rivers, and the inclusion of real detail makes the images authentic and therefore influences the responder to actually create them in their mind. Now, while this is a sketch, there are a couple of moments of tension, and one of those is, and it's portrayed using the vernacular, of the sundowner carrying his Royal Albert and his billy in one hand and a stick in the other. Notice the detail. The vernacular Royal Albert and billy and sundowner bring to life a real bush character, a stock character. Lawson brings the image of the sundowner to active life, so we get an anecdote. It's a very short snippet of a story, and he uses visual detail of actions. The verbs slipped, dropped, ran and flourishing bring to mind the comedic image of a man dropping all his gear and then running towards the train with a stick. Now Lawson first of all suggests that it was because he'd been driven mad, and that he was lonely and that the poverty and the heat had finally got to him. But it turns out that the sundowner is actually attacking a snake. Lawson makes asides. So he actually speaks directly to the reader who is imagining the world that is being described or portrayed. So the reader's actually with Henry Lawson, or the persona, the traveller, and is spoken to directly through asides, so that we get his insight into his thoughts. He says, perhaps he had cooked the snake, but then he makes this other interesting comment where he says, using a biblical allusion, look, perhaps he only thought of Adam. The train's moved on, he's not quite sure what did happen, but the snake brings to mind the story of Adam and how after temptation, and which is represented by the snake in the original biblical story, that Adam was bound to work for the rest of his life, that he would be banished from heaven and live a difficult existence. Lawson links such notions to the landscape of the Australian outback and to the poorer classes of working people in difficult times, for example, in a dry season. Lawson uses locations on the Western Rail line as markers in his narrative. The responder knows that the further west you go, the more isolated it becomes, and in a dry season, the hotter and the more difficult. Lawson gives an insight into his view of the importance of settling Australia, and that this meant that the land was cleared, the crops were growing, and that this would bring prosperity. He presents this laconically, which means sort of in a dry, witty, humorous way, in the comment that the least horrible spot in the bush in the dry season is where the bush isn't. What he's saying here is it's in the settled and the cleared lands that life is bearable. He makes an authorial comment here, and it has a really high level of modality. And he says, they talk of settling the people on the land, better settle in it. The preposition on and in are contrast. So the idea that, yes, we want to settle people on the land, he's saying better to settle in it. It's ironic because he's sort of saying that, well, if you come out this far into the bush, inevitably it will lead to death. He actually then visually depicts that, he'd rather live by the water, and says, but he does also say, in a sense, in a rather positive way, and an idea of looking forward, which is again about his concern and his desire for nation building, that the Western area will be great and he wouldn't mind living beside a giant system of irrigation when it's perfected in the West. And he sees this as an important, albeit not having happened yet, image of prosperity. The image that I have in front of you is actually a very current image from the Western Districts, not quite Bourke, but in the Warren area, of massive channels of irrigation. So in Lawson bringing this image to the mind of the responder and then creating it by depicting it for us visually, he's actually making a comment about the importance of people in the city understanding that there needed to be money spent on infrastructure to bring about quality of life and prosperity in the West. Otherwise you are settling people where death would be a constant companion. That's why he uses the motif so often. The next marker that is used is the town of Byrock. And again, there's a change in the people that we meet. He introduces the vernacular term for a rural worker, a shearer, and that it's from Byrock on where we will be seeing the first of these men. This is actually an image of some Bourke shearers, okay, and they look quite different to the itinerant workers that we saw earlier with the hats. These men are wealthier and much more independent. They are also historically linked to the formation of the labour movement and to the union demands for good conditions or improved conditions for workers. Lawson describes them with a positive connotative words in saying that they have the look of independence, so it invites the responder to see a man who's quite proud and quite at ease with himself. Of course, the shearers aren't on the train. We're now looking outside the train. And so we're introduced to them sitting on trucks and wool bales on the fence and watching the train. Again, the men are not active if you look at the verbs sit. Sat. Which visually depicts the effects of a dry season on the population. So the shearer, who's a stock character, is then sort of described in quite a bit of detail. And so, again, he looks at hats, and they're hats with straps, and four bearded faces under them. Notice that the preposition direct the responder to construct the appearance of the stock character. Proud, independent, physically very fit, and bearded. The Indigenous or the Aboriginal people often appear in Lawson's short stories, but they are definitely portrayed and described in a particular way, and this reflects the predominant view of the settlers in the early sections of the 20th century. So we're introduced to the Indigenous black tracker who's in, quote, a masher uniform. This is not an Indigenous person who is culturally free. This is someone who is bound and has been civilised and put to work in the outback. So here we have a Indigenous person who worked as a black tracker in the Bourke district. Lawson describes him as a splendid looking black tracker. Now the adjective is quite interesting because it is sort of connotative of his ability to be part of the landscape even in the dry season and not to be overly affected by it. Everyone else is mummified or beaten or tired or listless or sitting or inactive, okay, because of the heat and also because of the lack of work, whereas the tracker is described as splendid. This could also denote not only that he is comfortable in that landscape, but that he looks splendid because he's been civilised by, which is evident by the uniform and the Wellington boots. Lawson brings us back into the train carriage, and here we are again introduced to the clothing that people are wearing so that we understand their social status, or we think we do at least, and so we construct it. So we have one or two square cut and standing up collars that struggle. So this is someone who's rather formally dressed. So here I'm just going to talk a little bit about contrast. So we've got the symbolism of apparel. So we've got who belongs, the splendid looking black tracker in the masher uniform. Who's vulnerable, the young man with a stand-up collar who's quite confined. And interestingly, you can also read that the masher uniform is a form of social control. So we have a couple of men in the train in rather formal attire, and we then come to understand that they're actually unemployed and that they start cheerfully out with a letter from the government, Labour Bureau in his pocket, and nothing else. And nothing else is sort of understatement. It implies very clearly that he has no money, but Lawson uses understatement so that we can see an empty pocket. okay, which gives us a sense of pathos or fear for the person. Again, there's a bit of contrast. He highlights the misconceptions that these young men in these starch collars hold, first of all by wearing starch collars, second of all by struggling, and the idea that they feel that their job will be easy walking distance from Bourke. And I've included this image because it's sort of the idea that they thought it was going to be a little bit like this, a much more socially organised and much easier environment, a little bit like Joe Wilson's courtship, a more settled environment. And so you've got this idea of the misconception, and it's obvious that it's not the landscape that these young men imagined. We know that even before they do. We then go on to find out that, it will turn out that when they arrive, they'll find that the station is 80 or 100 miles away. We're privy to this information because Lawson has involved us in the story. It's like we're with him. We're a fellow traveller. And so we're privy to his understanding and his reading of the misunderstanding of the characters, including the recently unemployed. And this is a real image of a station outside of Bourke, which is about 110 k's, I think, and a very long walk. The unemployed man's circumstance is portrayed in considerable detail, as is his realisation that when he gets there, Lawson knows that the mateship and the camaraderie will ensure that the publican and the coach driver will actually take care of this poor young fellow. Now, Lawson is really not impressed with the social system in New South Wales at the time, and so he exclaims in an authorial comment, "God bless the publican and the coach driver. God forgive our social system." This visually depicts who should be admired, the worker, the person who shows solidarity. And there's a sort of a sense that there needs to be a change. And Lawson wants to be part of that by bringing it to the reader's attention, because we see the plight, we see the circumstance, and we feel great sorrow. He's motivating us to think about an egalitarian society for Australia. His focus then moves outside the train again, and he describes a rather poor circumstance of a home with 3 tiles, a chimney pot and a slab, but he has great admiration for the bushcraft and their tenacity because he links that image to native industry. So while Lawson portrays a microcosm of society, that means a small group, a bit of an understanding of how society functions. So as I was saying, as he portrays that microcosm of the worker and all the hardships they face, he also sees and makes us visually aware of their ability to do quite a lot with very few resources. In a sense, it's the admiration for the battler in that sort of depiction, which of course is another stock character that's played a fairly significant role in the construction of the Australian national identity. So after the description of the rather harsh living conditions of the small home that we've just gone past and we're looking at with Lawson, because he's described it for us, he's interrupted, and so we are too, and involved in a conversation. And it's the very colloquial dialogue where his company says to him, if you want to see the country, you get away from the line. This creates a moment of realism so that we're actually there in part participating in the conversation. And then we gain an insight into just how reliable our narrator is, because he says, I don't, I've been. Very simple. You know, he doesn't want to go any further out back because he's been away from the line. So this conversation in the train makes very evident to us that Lawson knows this land, that he's actually travelled in it quite a bit before, and he also knows how much more difficult it is further away from the railway line. Lawson brings to life the vastness of the landscape and the dangers of it once you leave the railway line, and he discourages his fellow traveller, that's us the responder, from actually taking such a trip. He does this first of all by describing the vast landscape in a figurative way and saying that, you know, right out there away from the line, it's like the brink of eternity. And once you're there at the brink of eternity, so almost tipping over the edge, you've got this sense that, you know, you will meet a swagman. That's what he says you'll do. But the swagman will be animated and say, oh, you ought to be out here, out back. And this animated swagman is metaphorically described as a mummy of a swagman. So they're linking the idea of the death of the mummy in ancient Egypt, to the actual visual depiction of the swagman, who is obviously beaten by the sun to the point that he looks like death. Lawson then goes on to describe this vast landscape a long way from the railway line as being the outback fiend. So he's actually using a rather exclamatory metaphor, and a fiend is demonic. So, and he's linking the demonic capacity to the landscape, so that within that landscape there are dangers, and the further away from civilization you get, the greater the dangers become. Lawson now leaves that behind and comes back into the train carriage again, and we're introduced to another stock character, the bush liar, and we've got all these rather lovely idiomatic sayings. You know, a bush liar in all his glory, the bush larrikin, and he's a really important stock character. Sometimes we like him, but in this depiction we probably don't. So the larrikin actually brags about what he's done, where he's been, and this confidence is actually reinforced by the repetition of the sentence form he. So there are a number of sentences that begin with, he still had 3 or 4 sheds to go, he had telegrams, he didn't give a blank, he was a bit of a scrapper. So Lawson creates a character through this recount of confidence and audacity. Lawson has the bush larrikin come to life through the dialogue. You know, what's 10 quid? He says. You know, 10 quid is £10, which is quite a substantial amount of money. Apparently he's lost it, or it's been stolen, which is part of the whole story in this little anecdote. But this what's 10 quid conjures up a rather rowdy and boastful shearer, and rowdiness and boastfulness are part of the larrikin character. The comment, he'd been everywhere, unquote, has a really mocking tone, and it sort of establishes the reaction of the other men for the responder. It's laconic, so it's a little bit humorous. It's a little bit of mocking him in some ways, and so the reason for this is because this particular larrikin is he's sort of an affront. He sort of annoys the people in the carriage, and indeed we're positioned to be annoyed by him too, by the way he's constructed in Lawson's descriptions of what he says and what he's done, because he's an affront to the egalitarian notions of the other persons in the train. So all the other men that we've met, and we know this because of the reaction of the other men. So in some ways the bush larrikin is a complication. Mind you, it's a small one. He continues this sort of bragging, and he sort of says things like, half a dozen squatters have been offering him jobs, and they've been offering him pens on any terms. This means that he's a pretty good shearer. He's sort of bragging as such. The exaggeration of the larrikin is idiomatic. It's very much in Australian speech. It's humour and it's amusing to listen to, but we know that he's not particularly likeable. I just thought I'd pop in a picture of some men shearing some sheep for you. Then we learn that he was a bit of a scrapper. That's a quote. This idea that he'd had some fights. There's actually a story that he had a fight with one of the supers, and gave him the father of all sort of beatings. This sort of portrays the Australian male as a very masculine, physically able man, and sort of actually goes hand in hand with Joe Wilson's courtship and his recollections of his early life as a young man prior to courting Mary. But I suppose the important aspect of this is that the larrikin can, while he's quite admired in our national identity, the larrikin can at times be negative. The episode with the larrikin goes on for quite a while. It's quite a long paragraph in what is only a 3-page text. And then there's this sort of very laid-back, understated moment where the quiet-looking bushman in the corner took the bush liar down in 3 minutes. Now, he means verbally, not physically, as in he proved that all that he'd said was not actually true. Just notice the prepositional language, that he's in the corner, so that we get this image of a bushman, where he is, and then his actions. So the sun sets. There's a long line of camels moving out across the sunset. You can hear the alliteration, and there's something snaky about the camels, which is a metaphor. Again, this recurring symbolism of the snake, and that could well be explained by the cameleers would have been Afghani, and they certainly were in Bourke, and Henry Lawson knew Bourke, so he would have known the Afghani cameleers. And so you have yet again a representation of the white Australia policy as being acceptable and decent. The responders at the time would have accepted that. The bulletin was actually a proponent of the white Australia policy. And the thinking of the time, whether we feel comfortable with it or not, was highly influenced by social Darwinism. Now, to create the sense that we're in the actual carriage on our way to Bourke, it ends with, here's Bourke, the dialogue, and it just says, somebody said, here's Bourke. And that's where the story actually ends. I'd just like to finish by thanking the Bourke community for many of the photographs that I've used in this presentation. To Karen Barker, an exceptionally talented photographer whose beautiful images of her hometown in Bourke actually inspired me to put these mini lessons together, and to the Indigenous community of Bourke who also shared their photographs of their elders.